Hi, everyone. Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Piper Auditorium. My name is Sarah Rafson. I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs here at the GSD, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Eric Höweler, Clay, Pedagogy, and Practice. As you're finding your seats, and there are a couple of seats here and in the front row, I'd like to just acknowledge that the place of this lecture, the Harvard Graduate School of Design, is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what we now know as Boston and Cambridge. I'd like to thank the Harvard University Native American program for their work developing this land acknowledgement you see here, but also foregrounding our obligations as a university to both the land and the people around us. So, in terms of closed captioning, I want to welcome those of you in the theater, but also our audience who are live streaming to this event. Our virtual audience can enable captions by clicking the closed caption icon at the bottom of the live stream screen. And for those of you in the audience who would like closed captioning as well, this link on this that you see here will get you there, and our colleagues Matt and Brian in the AV booth would be happy to assist if you need it. I'd also like to flag a couple of upcoming public programs for you on our next slide. On Thursday, September 12th, this week, Chelina Odbert, co-founder of the Konkui Initiative and also a GSD alum, will deliver this year's Margaret McCurry Lecture, Situating Justice, Reflections on Mission-Driven Practice. And then a week later, on Thursday, September 19th, we'll host a screening of Perfect Days, which is a recent film by the acclaimed director Wim Wenders that follows the life of a toilet cleaner in Tokyo, and should be a great event. Those are just two of the many amazing events that are organized this semester, so please visit the GSD's website to find more information and to see the full schedule of public programs. Now, please join me in welcoming Grace Law, the chair of the Department of Architecture.
Wow, full house. I want to extend a warm welcome. Thank you, Sarah, and welcome back, everyone. I really hope that you've enjoyed the summer and are digging into what I sense is going to be an amazing and productive, stimulating semester. I'm really proud that we are beginning this academic year with a public lecture by one of our own here at the GSD, Eric Höweler. This choice was not made as a matter of convenience, but rather to honor two things about Eric. First, at the end of this past spring semester, Eric earned the title of Full Professor of Architecture without limit of time. It is a uniquely personal pleasure for me to highlight this promotion because the last time the faculty awarded tenure in architecture was over a decade ago in 2013 when I became full professor. So the rarity of this circumstance attests to the impressiveness of Eric's achievements, which brings me to the second reason for beginning this year's lecture series with Eric, and that is, of course, his work. You can study many of Eric's designs over the past 2 decades and the concepts motivating his practice in his 2022 book, Verify in Field, published with his partner in life and in architecture, Mi-Jin Yoon. I trust that Eric will speak tonight both about these ideas and about his work as founding co-principal at Höweler and Yoon, which began in 2004. I anticipate hearing more about the studio's acclaimed project from 2020, a memorial to enslaved laborers who built the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And that project embodies the fundamental idea of Verify in Field. This term, written as the acronym VIF on architectural drawings, typically serves as a contractual prompt to confirm details such as site measurements. Yet for Höweler and Yoon, it is also a reminder that a proposal's details, large and small, gain potency when embedded within the specificities of site and situation. And situation here can range from local politics to global climate change. So the design for the UVA memorial demonstrates Eric's ability to address a project's situation by listening with generosity and skill to diverse inputs from collaborators and community members. As Eric's colleague, I witness and appreciate this responsiveness in him every day. I have not yet visited the UVA memorial, so I will comment on one of the studio's design projects that I do know directly, another memorial. The 2015 Collier Memorial, just down the road at MIT, sets up the aspirations for what a memorial can be, imaginatively and powerfully. For those of you new to Cambridge, Sean Collier was an MIT campus police officer slain in the line of duty in the aftermath of the 2013 Boston marathon bombing. So in 2015, Höweler and Yoon completed this architectural tribute to Collier's life. And the memorial's innovative form of 5 intersecting arches asserts a design authority while also remaining open, providing a porous space for mourning and for gathering. The arched segments extending in plan like a large kind of abstract hand stretching out from above embraces those who walk within the ovoid volumes of the space formed below. And to me, it feels poignantly incomplete, yet somehow miraculously stable, hewn from carefully interlocking coins. And I must say that even though this memorial is made of stone, its curves are unexpectedly engaging, and I almost want to hug it. So this fragmented stone vault pairs the most contemporary processes of erratic fabrication with the most ancient principles of stereotomic masonry construction. And this seeming contradiction, or oxymoronic conjunction, is an example of why I regard this memorial as representative of Höweler Yoon and Yoon's methodology. Their designs seek out, sustain, and deploy architecturally productive, site-specific, project-specific tensions, always attempting to bridge the geometrically abstract with the materially prosaic. So working in this space of tension expresses the verify in field approach. A designer's intentions remain contingent upon the physical realities of making. While a material contingency is in some sense obvious, the discipline of architecture has, since the Renaissance, developed a split between design and construction. Architectural historian Mario Carpo argues that Leon Battista Alberti, in his 15th century treatise on building, effectively invented the modern architect, figuring the architect as the humanist author of drawings as opposed to of buildings themselves. Elaborating on this idea in 1986, our own late Robin Evans wrote that architects do not make buildings, they make drawings of buildings, emphasizing that the notational art of drawing bridges this divide. The current exhibition in our gallery today, curated by Farshid Mousavi, underscores the tension between architect and builder, representation and realization, the idealized and the material. In his practice, Eric grapples with the complex interplay between design and real-world constraints, between concept and construction, and he has been teaching GSD students to do so as well. Eric's pedagogical emphasis on becoming familiar with building materials and methods gives students key tools for figuring things out. His instruction, like his design work, models how to verify in field. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Eric Höweler. So happy.
Thank you, Grace. Thanks, everybody, for coming. The space is very familiar to me, but it's particularly intimidating tonight. Pedagogy and practice. This is an opportunity for me to sort of share a little bit about what I've been thinking about, these two spaces, the space of pedagogy, the space of the academy, the space of idealism, and the space of practice, the real world, the sort of nitty-gritty. We often think about ideals and discourse and form, sometimes removed from cost, constraints, constructability, in the first. And in the second, we seem to talk only about costs, constraints, and constructability. So I'd like to sort of put these two realms into some sort of productive tension tonight, and I'd also like to dispel certain myths about them. I think one of the fallacies about these two terms is that one precedes the other. Pedagogy precedes practice. It's sequential, it's hierarchical. One is a rehearsal for the other, and I think that's not accurate. I'd like to propose that we should think about them in parallel, put them in tension, allow one to inflect the other, and to think about them as codependent and complementary. So what about clay? Why clay? I thought it'd be sufficiently intriguing to attract you all here if I had a title that was completely ambiguous. So clay, as you know, is a fine grain soil distinct from sand and silt and loam. It appears in our geotechnical reports. We think about that primarily when we work on foundations, like what's the bearing pressure. It's abundant and ubiquitous. It's a vast substance unseen beneath our feet. It's also malleable, and its plasticity is one of its qualities. We can shape it into a ball, into a pot, into a figure. It can become a ritual object. It can also be transformed into something more permanent, the raw material for buildings, brick, ubiquitous. It's been described as synonymous with civilization. When we could fire bricks, we could assemble buildings, architecture as civilization making. How big is a brick? Hanif asked me that the other day. It's important to know, how big is a brick? I put the dimensions here just in case. But the most important thing is it's about the size of a hand, right? There's a relationship between the hand and the brick. On the one hand, you hold the brick with your left hand, you hold the trowel with your other hand, and that was what allows that act to unfold. You could say that the body of the mason is inscribed in the dimensions of the brick. You could also say that bricks have their own ethics. They bring a form of making, a kind of rigor that comes from the modularity. So Sigurd Leverance said that no brick could be cut on this church in Klippan, Sweden. And that simple rule of no cutting bricks produces all kinds of effects, side effects. Think about this sort of staggered or corbelled wall end with the bricks unable to be cut or staggered. The joints become very elastic and the mortar expands to allow this sort of rigor to unfold. On the inside, brick is used for the flooring, for the vaulting, for the furniture. It's a monomaterial, and Leverance is sort of showing us what he can do with one material and one rule. This is the moment where the bricks in the floor start to jostle and splinter, and we see the grain of the brick as it transitions from the floor into the baptismal font. And here we see the kind of rule of no brick cut sort of manifesting itself beautifully. Closer to home, in the Harkness Commons building just up the road, Joseph Albers created this mural entitled America. It's in a building designed by Walter Gropius, and he invited Albers to design a mural. And rather than add something to the wall, Albers removes bricks. He removes material, using shadow to sort of create a pattern, evoking a kind of tapestry or a weave. You see the kind of precision of the joints, the cut brick, the sort of gap, and if you look carefully, even the gap between the bricks and the lack of mortar in those joints and the light coming through, he's sort of asking us to pay kind of closer attention to these bricks. So a couple years ago I read this book, Red Brick, Black Mountain, White Clay, and it's been sort of tumbling around in my head. Christopher Benfey weaves a beautiful tale, a search for origins, a kind of narrative of journeys and migration. It's partly autobiographical. Christopher's related to Ani Albers, so he's searching for his origins, but he takes us from Berlin to Asheville, North Carolina, and to Harvard, looking for the sources of bricks, the sources of clay to make porcelain. But really, it's about the creative process. It's about thinking and making. So I've been thinking about this squishy, slippery substance, clay. How do you become a great potter? You have to make a lot of pots. You need a lot of clay. Clay is an analog for practice, and pottery and its repetition is an analog for pedagogy. Learning by doing it over and over. We have a kind of impatience for solutions. We want our designs quickly, but clay is a slow medium, and I would argue architecture is too. So it's a medium of transformation of the material, but also of ourselves. How do we train ourselves to become skilled architects? How do we train architects? We need lots of buildings, and we need lots of clay. So with this malleable material in mind, I'd like to share some examples of our work, our pottery, if you will, in the spirit of thinking by doing and continuously reflecting on what we've done and how to do it better. I've organized the lecture into 6 themes. Speaking about origins, many narratives of American architecture begin with Thomas Jefferson and this academical village at the University of Virginia. I learned about it as a student in architectural history. The academical village was a utopia. It was a purely conceptualized space of learning, a community of scholars here constructed in Albemarle County, Virginia. The part of Jefferson's plan that most intrigued me was the so-called serpentine wall. Undulating gently, the curvature allows them to stabilize by effectively spreading their effective base, resisting the tendency to overturn and allowing the bricks to be 1 wythe thick. This sketch by Thomas Jefferson shows his process of calculating how many bricks does it take to have a straight wall with intermittent structural supports versus how many bricks does it take to use an undulating wall. And his calculus reveals that the undulating wall is cheaper to build, more efficient, and uses less bricks. So it wasn't an aesthetic decision, it was an efficiency decision, an optimization, if you will. And that reveals Jefferson to be thinking kind of a rational designer. So this is a statue of Thomas Jefferson at University of Virginia. It shows Jefferson in the process of surveying the campus with a sextant in the background and the topographical survey in his hands. He's depicted as a great visionary, peering into the future to transform map into territory through the execution of his vision for the academical village. Now, what the statue and commemorative plaques don't say is that Jefferson was a landowner and an owner of enslaved peoples. During his life, Jefferson enslaved about 600 men, women, and children. The enslaved labored in his fields, cooked his meals, and constructed his house. The task of making bricks was typically done by enslaved boys. Their fingerprints are still legible in the bricks at Monticello. All right, you can see the pinky and the ring finger and the middle finger. Now, brick makers used to press the bricks to check their hardness before firing them. So this was typical of brick making. But the choice to turn it around, to show us the bricks, I have to imagine that that's an act of resistance, right? If it's typically meant to be hidden, to turn the brick around, to reveal and expose those traces, those human traces, seems to me to be speaking to us. The mason is saying, I was here. We were here. See us. So this little detail in this brick embedded in the walls of Monticello tell us a great deal about the culture that made them, the people that made them, and the context in which they were produced. I like to say that brick has a very particular color. It has a patina. It has a terroir, something that gives it a particular taste, a particular place. Bricks are heavy. We don't transport them very far. They're always local. And so this local color, this local texture is particular to Albemarle County, Virginia. So here's Monticello. If you go to Monticello, take a look around the corner. In the wall, just around the corner there is where those fingerprints are. It's astounding to discover those traces. But University of Virginia, the academical village, we know this. It's been sort of lodged in our brains the rotunda, the pavilions, Palladian-inspired, stepping down with the landscape, the colonnade that binds them together, the compression towards the rotunda that creates an optical illusion of perspectival depth, the pleasure gardens on the outside, the formal lawn on the inside. This is the kind of archetypal space of academic planning. These renderings from 1830 show us the terrace landscape. It shows us the spaces of the professors in the pavilions and the students in between in the lower left-hand corner. What do we see? Hiding in plain sight, the institution that was concealed and unspoken for so many years is revealed in this etching, where an enslaved woman and a white child are depicted on the terrace of the pavilions. So Lewis Nelson's an architectural historian at UVA. He's been studying the grounds. He describes the historic grounds as a plantation landscape. He describes the structure of society at the time. He describes the professors living in the houses, in the pavilions, the students living in the lawn rooms. He describes it as a segregated landscape. Professors occupied the upper levels, the students the lower levels. Professors could walk across those upper terraces. And so it was already segregated. He wrote and edited this book, Educated in Tyranny, describing his findings of the University of Virginia, dramatically recasting what we understood as a kind of formal operation into something quite different. These are renderings that were produced at the time showing what the structure of the university looked like at the time. It was open-ended, looking over the landscape. The yards behind, enclosed by the serpentine walls, that today are pleasure gardens in a French or your English tradition, were actually work yards. This is where the enslaved worked. They chopped wood, they slaughtered animals. They did all the work to make the university function. And the section through the lawn shows us the rotunda as a terminus. It shows us the pavilions that we think from the lawn side, that we think they're two-story pavilions. Lewis Nelson makes a point of saying they're three-story pavilions. Jefferson placed the lawn on a ridge. The land falls away on both sides, allowing a walkout basement condition to occur on both sides. And in that lower level, that's where the enslaved lived and worked. Architectural historian Mabel Wilson describes Jefferson's use of the section as an architect. He's using the section to hide the institution of slavery. She interprets his use of section as a recognition that he felt that this institution was abhorrent and needed to be concealed. And the concealing of the section and the labor of the enslaved and the serpentine retaining wall were part of his plan to reconcile a society that he felt couldn't function without it, but was necessarily obscured by the architecture. So in 2016, it was announced that there was a permanent memorial to be constructed at the University of Virginia. Mija and I traveled to Charlottesville. We met with faculty who had worked with students on the previous efforts to build a memorial. We assembled a team, including Mabel Wilson, architectural historian, Frank Dukes, a community organizer and UVA faculty member, Greg Bleem, a landscape architect based in Charlottesville, and Eto Otitigbe, a visual artist based in Brooklyn. And we prepared for the interview. We engaged the committee in a dialogue, and after that we were awarded a commission to design this permanent memorial. But when we interviewed, we said we don't have a design, we're going to design a process, and that process will unfold over the next 6 months. And over the next 6 months, we'll figure out where the memorial should be, what form it should take, and how it should be defined. And through that process of engagement with the community, with the descendant community, with the faculty and staff, with the students, but also the residents of Charlottesville, we heard what they were aspiring for the memorial, how it should tell truths, how it should begin a process of repair, how it should be situated not on the grounds, which many descendants regarded as intimidating, foreboding, unwelcoming. They referred to the campus as the plantation. The siting of the memorial slightly between the campus and the town. So here is Mabel and Frank during one of our charrettes studying different locations, some of the engagement processes, meeting with students, meeting with community members, trying to understand what they were hoping for from the memorial. And towards the end of this process, we landed on a site here between the campus and the town. This is a slope site. The rotunda is just above on the top of the hill. And we landed on this form that wasn't an object, but was really a kind of void, a kind of hollow, a kind of opening. And we thought at the most basic level, it's a circle that allows the community to gather, to see themselves as a community. The form of the memorial was a kind of a landform. It's sited tangent to the primary path. It forms two rings, one that rises steeply on the inside and more shallow on the outside. And on those surfaces are inscribed the names of the enslaved and a number of historical timeline markers on the inside. But fundamentally, the memorial was meant to be a kind of space of refuge, a kind of clearing in the woods, a place where the community could come, learn about their history, and sort of see themselves as a community. This aerial photograph shows it in its relationship to the rotunda, which we know is a kind of partial sphere. It's a domed interior, whereas the memorial is a bowl-shaped cone. It's open to the sky. It's open along the path. In a way, it's a kind of contrast with the geometries of the rotunda. We did mock things up, and I like to say that if you stand at the base of the memorial with your foot at the slope, you extend your arm, the line between your hand and your foot becomes a plane, and that plane becomes the surface of the cone. So from the inside, you're sort of contained within this horizon line of the memorial. From the outside, you can't see in. And that's important to create a sense of interiority, a sense of privacy and intimacy to sort of allow for a contemplative moment. So these are the drawings showing the berm, the landform, the buttress walls, and the stone. Also the bench and the water feature that incorporates the timeline in its surface. These are the mock-ups showing this, the bench and the memorial. And working with Eto Otitigbe on the articulation of the memorial, we heard from the community that they didn't want this to be sanitized and abstract. They wanted to be truthful about the institution of slavery. And so they also wanted imagery. And I think as architects, we struggled how to produce and integrate an image. So Eto, who is a visual artist, was visiting one of the cemeteries at UVA, and he took this photograph of this tombstone, and the rough hewn surface of this tombstone he thought was interesting. And he found this photograph of Isabella Gibbons. Isabella Gibbons was an enslaved woman who lived at UVA. She was owned by a professor at UVA. And she learned how to read and write. After the Civil War, she stayed in Charlottesville, became a teacher, and wrote about her experiences. So she became, in a way, of kind of figure for the project, a figure of resistance, of resiliency. And Eto was taken by her photograph, and he incorporated her photographic image into the memorial. So this is the photograph that we found. Note the stamp is from the Boston Public Library. And we wondered, why is her photograph in the Boston Public Library? Why not in the University of Virginia Library or Archive? Turns out this is in the Boston Public Library because her owner, the person that enslaved her, was William Barton Rogers, founder of MIT. So, professor of chemistry at UVA, and now founder of MIT. That was astounding to see. We walk under this entablature frequently, never thought about that name over that entablature and what that meant. This is where our sort of worlds sort of collided. Eto Otutigbe, photographed here in the middle, he took a number of self-portraits of himself. He inscribed his portrait into the material through a process of digital carving, turning a kind of raster image into a toolpath, producing a kind of abstract image. And he did this with Isabella Gibbons' eyes, so sort of taking her portrait and inscribing them in the surface of the stone through these parallel grooves. And so as the light changes, you sort of see the image sort of emerge through the variable width of the groove and the variable lighting on the memorial. So the outer face of the memorial has this sort of scallop texture that's related to that rough hewn stone. The parallel grooves are actually evocative of drill marks that we see in quarries. And into those grooves are integrated this image. And so if you squint at that, you can see the colossal eye of Isabella Gibbons looking out from the memorial. And so if you go to Charlottesville and you look at the memorial, with the right light, you can see, her two eyes sort of peering out from the exterior texture of the stone. And some of the descendants describe Isabella Gibbons as a witness and a watcher, that she's watching over them from this memorial. And that's incredibly powerful, that they've interpreted the memorial this way, and they sort of claim it in a way as their own because their ideas went into it, and they see themselves represented in the memorial. Looking at the construction, I noted the kind of orange color of the soil, which you see it in the bricks, but it has a particular richness because of its iron content, transforming an abstract digital model into a physical thing, where one swoop produced by multiple panels of stone perfectly aligned to produce that sense of a monolith is quite remarkable. When you visit the memorial, the path is the path connecting the town to the rotunda, so everybody walks along here. The tangent relationship to the path is an invitation. It's so easy to just veer off and enter the memorial. And as you go in, the wall on your left rises very slightly. The ground drops ever so slightly, and before you know it, you're inside. And all of a sudden, the university, the town disappears, and you're surrounded by the memorial. One of the challenges for the memorial was to represent the 4,000 enslaved African Americans that had worked here. And one of the challenges is there were no records. There were no records of their names, and oftentimes they were referred to as extra hands, or they were referred to in property logs or letters describing a carpenter or a butler. They were known for their jobs, their skills, what they were doing. So taking the 577 partial names, the kinship and occupations, we struggled to design something that would acknowledge 4,000 individuals. And so this was the proposal to sort of etch these memory marks into the stone, these horizontal scores, these grooves. That would be 4,000 placeholders, many of them blank because we don't know what their names were. When we knew the name, we inscribed it. When we didn't know the name, but we knew an occupation, we inscribed farmer, carpenter, bricklayer. And when we knew kinship, we inscribed mother or father, daughter. And so if you visit today, the experiences of this sort of cloud of grooves, and there's 4,000 of them, and it's in a way staggering just to see 4,000 of anything, 4,000 marks, 4,000 people. We were photographing the memorial the summer it opened, and it rained abruptly. As the memorial started to dry, the surface of the memorial warmed up, the water evaporated, and the water that was trapped in the grooves started to spill out like this, like the memorial was crying or bleeding. This was a surprise to me. I found it incredibly moving to see how the memorial had absorbed the water and had allowed it to sort of trickle out like this. But looking at the specifics, because each cut is a person, each cut represents a person whose name we don't know. So it's unknown name, unknown, unknown, grandfather, carpenter, brickmaker. If we sort of pull out and we look at the memorial, it's a kind of a rough exterior with the sort of implicit textures of making, the implicit and integrated imagery of Isabella Gibbons. We see the smooth interior and the contrast between the two. The memorial was completed just after the murder of George Floyd and just at the beginning of the pandemic. And so in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, people were looking for places to grieve, places for people to gather, and the memorial became that place. People came in small groups to take a knee. They came in large groups. This is it's across the street from University of Virginia Medical School. So these are the white coats for Black Lives who took a knee for 9 minutes to remember George Floyd and to be together. And so one of the things that we learned through this was unexpected, this was undesigned. We thought we were looking at injustice in the past, and here it was serving a function of racial justice in the present, but also giving a community a place to be. The idea that architecture and landscape brings people together. It convenes, and that convening power, I think, is its power. At the same time, the Confederate monuments were being challenged. Meejan likes to say that memorials give voice, but certain monuments silence. These monuments silence, they intimidate, they oppress. And so as the University of Virginia Memorial to Enslaved Laborers was going up, the Confederate monuments started to come down. The builder for the University of Virginia Memorial to Enslaved Laborers was Devon Henry. And he got a phone call one day from the governor saying, "I hear you build memorials, can you take them down?" And I think he jumped at that opportunity. He was given 2 weeks to take down the monuments in Richmond. These are some of the parts of some of the memorials, monuments from Monument Ave in Richmond. Okay, shifting a little bit from memory to material, although certainly there's material in the first chapter. Material inscribes culture, it inscribes place, it comes from the earth that it was made of. In 2009, we got a cryptic email saying, we're working on a group project in Chengdu, would you be interested to join this group project? Maybe you can work on parcel G. There's 2 conditions. We require it to be a courtyard house, and it must have a sloped roof. And we said, sure. We can do that. We studied Chinese typologies, courtyard houses, gardens. The courtyard house forms both a field and a figure. It can be an object, it can be a frame. And we thought that was interesting. Our first meeting with our client, we presented our scheme. All of us were reprimanded. We were almost fired. The client did not recognize anything Chinese about these projects. He was looking for something he called Chineseness. He sent us off to study Chinese architecture. We went to Suzhou. We went to the Ermei Mountains. We climbed up the mountain. We were woken up before dawn. We were marched out to the view, and Philip Yuan, who was standing next to me, said, "See that? That's Chinese feeling. That. Can't draw it, can't specify it, but that's what we're looking for. Can you do that?" We went back to the drawing board. We redesigned the building. We incorporated elements windows, composed brick, slopes. We finished our drawings of the windows with their Corten steel surrounds. We submitted our drawings, and then we waited. This is 2010. We didn't hear anything for 6 months, and then we got an email saying, congratulations, the project's under construction. It's a different site. It's a different program. And we've mirrored your plans. But we'd like them updated. Could you please have them to us in 2 weeks? So I went to Chengdu. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to see with my own eyes what was happening. They were, in fact, building our plans, mirrored backwards. I say in China, it's not less is more, it's like more or less. It's like more or less like your plans, not quite exactly the way you specified them. So we completed our drawings. We picked this beautiful gray brick for the facade material. We figured it's the thing that ties it to the place. It's abundant. Could we do brick in a slightly different way that would sort of evoke the place and give it that sort of Chinese feeling that would ground it in the place, be familiar to the client, but also imagine what it could be. Interestingly, halfway up the wall, they ran out of certain bricks and they used different bricks. And so we have this sort of transition of color, which we found disturbing at first. But actually, now that I think about it, it's kind of nice. If it were all uniform, that would be flat. And this has so much more character. The window surrounds are Corten steel. They amplify these small punched windows, make them into larger configurations. This is the edge of the building. You see the feathering of the brick on the left. This is the raw material, the sort of abundant gray brick that we sort of associate with certain parts of China. We imagined that maybe we could propose that each brick would have a kind of compass in it. And so the brick would orient itself always to the cardinal directions. That was our one instruction. So we produced 2 sheets of drawings. We said every brick will be cardinal, regardless of the local geometry of the architecture, right? The wall is oblique. When the wall goes oblique, the bricks stay cardinal. A simple rule, one that you could transmit across culture, across geography, across distance. And so the brick masons laid the brick, and they laid it faithfully. So this is an east-west wall, flat. This is an oblique northeast-ish wall that cuts on a different angle. And so in its texturing, in its feathering, it reminds us of where we are. It reminds us of a kind of larger, kind of global Cartesian orientation. And it alerts us to which walls are oblique. And it also has this incredible texture. When this was finished, the client said, "You've got that Chinese feeling," which was an incredible compliment because we didn't know what that meant. It was familiar enough to him, and it was, for us, it was innovative enough. And we've somehow found some sort of middle ground where it was speaking to him and it was also resonating with us. Fast forward. This is the site of the 2010 Shanghai Expo. It was a former industrial zone. And after the expo, wait, is that the expo? That's after the expo. It's a brownfield site that was projected as a public park. So a new public park in Shanghai. It's a massive park, complete with artificial lakes. Some of the pavilions, like the French pavilion, is still there. We were asked to compete for 2 bridges that would be connecting the landscape to the subway. We said rather than design 2 bridges, maybe we design 1 bridge with some holes in it to frame the sky. That seemed like a good idea. We presented the scheme. I said something like, it's not about geometry, it's about relationships. It's about vistas, near and far. It's about spaces to be alone. It's about spaces to be together. And I saw the head of the jury nodding, and I thought, okay, I found a hook. They awarded this competition, and then again, it went silent. And for 6 months, we wondered what's happening. one day we got an email saying, oh, we're developing your project. We can't seem to get it approved. Could we ask for your help? And so we were brought back into the process to help refine the geometry to allow them to get approved, to allow them to build the project. So during the pandemic, we get these photographs. Astounding to see the construction of this bridge. It's wider than it is deep. It's an atypical engineering feat. And the other thing we discovered is there's a parking garage underneath it, right? Which wasn't there originally. So yes, bridge over lake over parking, connecting to subway. We asked for these compound curved concrete forms. So they're curved in plan, they're curved in section, they're toroidal, right? They're constantly revolving to produce these beautiful hull-like sort of underbellies to the bridge. We asked for the surface of the pavers to be granite and transition from granite pavers in the flat to sort of these textured rotating modules on the parapets. So that it would sort of always have that texture or the kind of reminder of the kind of individual unit, even as it sort of approximates a kind of monolithic whole. And it did produce moments of, you could imagine a large group gathering on this plaza. You could imagine a solitary person sort of looking out over the landscape. So it does achieve a kind of flicker between the kind of individual and the collective, between a kind of infrastructural scale, a landscape scale, and an architectural scale. Thinking about environment, we proposed this pavilion in Shenzhen. So we've been doing a lot of work in China. Shenzhen is just north of Hong Kong. It's one of the cities in the Pearl River Delta that had explosive growth. A number of new business districts are sort of popping up around transit, and this pavilion was meant to be an amenity in this park. And so Shenzhen is incredibly hot and humid, and we said maybe the pavilion has a kind of generosity. Maybe it sort of creates space by making shade. Maybe that shade is something that extends well beyond the footprint of the building. So we imagined a kind of shaded microclimate around the enclosure of the building. We looked at the surrounding context and said, how would this perform without a shade, and maybe how would it perform with this shading canopy? We designed the canopy to sort of index the sort of orientation of the sun as it moves around. We looked at different shapes and wondered, could this do more than just block the sun? Could it diffuse the light? Could it create a quality of light? And we were reminded of Miguel Fisac, who did these beautiful concave profiles that sort of bounce the light into the factory buildings. And so this was a pair of concave profiles that bounce the light around and allow for diffuse light to enter underneath the pavilion. We specified a custom die for a custom extrusion, and this was a construction photograph with these extrusions spanning between these frames. During the pandemic, it was used for a COVID testing center, which I guess is a testament to its civic sort of position. But it is a kind of anchor program within this new development. And I do think, given its sort of extents, that it can sort of create a transition between inside and outside, between conditioned and unconditioned. Just coming back to the States for a moment, this may look like University of Virginia. It's not. This is Yale, the Divinity School, designed by Delano and Aldrich, 1932, modeled on the academical village. So the academical village is lurking within our imaginary of what is an institution of higher education. So 10 pavilions terminating not in a library, but in a steeple, right? A church. When we were approached by the Divinity School, they asked us to do an addition, to add a dormitory to this precinct. And we said, how do you add to something that's complete? It's perfect. It's perfectly complete. How do you do an addition to that? The other challenge was that they wanted living building challenge, which is incredibly hard to achieve. Living building challenge is not just sustainability, it's equity, it's energy, it's water, it's materials, it's healthy, it's all these things. And it made us reflect on what are we doing as architects? Where are we focusing on building arts like materials and details, building science like performance and technique, but also this question of building equity. Can architecture reinforce a community? Can it create employment? Can it create education? Can it create its own food? Can it create fresh water? So this is the site plan we developed for the Divinity School. It's another room. Yale is made of all these outdoor rooms. It's an outdoor room adjacent to the symmetrical quadrangle of the Divinity School. It takes its primary profile from the pavilions, and then it extrudes them into a roof form that's determined by the sun angle. Right? It's facing south. We're sort of turning the roof towards the sun. I described it as a kind of sundial or a sunflower. The facades are screening daylight on the interior faces. The exterior faces take their cues from the water table profile of the historic buildings. So these brick profiles that are, see them here, on the original building become the kind of extruded texture of the screen for the Divinity School. And of course, with Living Building Challenge, we're sourcing these locally. We're accounting for healthy materials. We're accounting for labor. There's water purification. There's a lot of solar power generation. This is an incredibly complex certification process to produce this Living Building Challenge building, which is currently under construction. This is the visual mock-up. And these are the terracotta extrusions that will be cladding this new addition to the Divinity School. One of the things about the Divinity School is that they can't find the front door because there's so many front doors. And so one of the sort of elements was, can we create a new sort of gateway? And you know Yale has all these particular gateways framing these outdoor rooms, these courtyard spaces. So here's a new dormitory with 54 beds. It's Living Building Challenge. You enter through here, you find this courtyard, then you enter into the traditional courtyard, and the spire is still the kind of wayfinding element. But you see the texture, the horizontal texture of the terracotta facade, and it sort of slips over the windows to sort of blur the edge between the punch window and the kind of opaque walls. So that's another version of thinking about environment, thinking about it rather comprehensively. How do we think about not just operational energy and energy production, but how do we think about preservation and embodied energy? You know, in a way, the building that you don't build, the building that's already there is like the most sustainable thing. So the Coolidge Corner Movie Theater is a historic theater built in the 1930s. It's beloved. They've got this Art Deco marquee. We were asked to add 2 auditoriums, 2 movie houses to the back of the building. So you see our building just peeking into the alley. If you've been there, this alley approach is sort of, it's part of the quirky culture of the Coolidge. This was the back side of the building as we found it, very much a back, fire escapes. The projectionist has to climb the fire escape with the film to get to the projection house, rain or shine. So that wasn't good. We tried to turn the back into a front, and so we added the 2 movie houses, preserved all the egress while creating a new front, a new glowing lobby space, and the movie houses within the opaque textured figure of the new theater. So here's some diagrams of its circulation. Here's the historic theater. It's one of my favorite theaters. If you're looking for a big movie, you want to see it on film. We saw Dunkirk in there on 60 millimeter. That's the place to see it. Our new movie houses, house 6 and 7. If you go like what's playing, check which movie house it's in, right? They'll tell you, movie house 6 or 7, the red one and the blue one. How do you add to a historic building without impacting it? We learned that our foundations shouldn't surcharge the existing footings. So rather than build adjacent to it, we set back, and then we cantilever back. And I say, our building just sort of, it kisses the historic building. See, we're setting back and just kissing that building. Here's the floor plate. We did insert a new elevator into the footprint of the historic theater. That was tricky. The Art Deco brickwork was one of our cues. The corbelling seen here in the bread brick, the herringbone patterns here. A lot of exuberance. I told them Art Deco is not a style, it's an attitude about technology. It's an attitude about the future. It's about electricity, radio, film. And so our proposal included this sort of undulating brick wall where each brick is articulated and it produces this sort of rippling effect. We thought this was achievable by simply increasing the length of the tiebacks to achieve this sort of curvature. As they started to lay the bricks, the mason said, hey, you know, if you'd like these to be curved, we can just smooth them out for you. I said, no, thank you. We like the texture. And they said, no, you might get some icicles. I said, no, thank you. They said you might get some water sitting on that, and it might sort of, undermine the mortar. I said, oh, God. We called our consultants. We did an icicle study. It's south-facing. We turned out that we could do a 3/4 inch overhang without risk of icicles, without risk of undermining the mortar. And thank goodness they went forward with the textured brick. It's south-facing. It gets this incredible blast of sunlight. Even in the winter, it animates the facade with all these shadow patterns. It's really lovely, even under construction. So that is a historic building that won, by adding to it, in a way, we gave it a kind of a life extension, right? These institutions are not-for-profits. They're struggling. They can't meet the needs. Adding theaters to it allows it to achieve a kind of financial stability, and it kind of allows it to continue to function. This building actually won a Historic Preservation Award, preserving the institution while animating the historic theater with an addition. So that was lovely. Shifting to housing. Okay, topic 4. Okay, I see. I got the sign. Housing. I'm going to fly through this. We have a housing crisis in Boston. Mayor Wu is desperately trying to build more housing. It's so unaffordable. Cost of construction has exceeded value creation. At that point, we don't build anymore because it doesn't make any sense. In the past few years, we've designed a number of multifamily housing projects. All housing projects in Boston have 13% affordable units. It's inclusionary zoning. It produces affordable units as a byproduct of producing new construction. I'm going to show you very quickly 2 housing projects, this one on a site in Southie. It's a site that was so narrow that nobody thought they could build on it, so it was overlooked by development. Development just passed it over. We got 11 units on this wedge-shaped site. All the units have outdoor windows, outdoor corners. We clad it in this terracotta shingle, which produces this lovely texture. So it's in a brick neighborhood, but it's not brick. It's got the texture and the material, the richness, but it's not literally mimicking its context. In terms of Boston, we built this building, Stewart Street, in a historically landmark neighborhood. This is Bay Village. It's right along the edge. It was a parking lot. Again, this site was so small, nobody thought they could build on it. So we got 7 units on this narrow plot. We thought maybe it would be good to clad it in something rich and thick and deep. And so these concave panels that we propose as precast were optimized for the crane pick, not for the module or the mold, but actually for the crane, the optimization for speed of construction. So these are 30 feet long. They extend without joints. And so when you look at it, you're like, what's so unusual about this? There's no joints in it. It's extending for 30 feet, giving it a kind of verticality. And the glazing is just an infill, just a gap in between. The story about this project is the neighbors to the south. They're in 2-story brownstone units. They've got stoops, they've got little flower boxes. They're looking across the street. They're like, this is a monster apartment building. I don't want to look at your mechanicals. So we said, okay, well, we can add 2 townhouses here with stoops and flower boxes and windows. And so they look across the street and they see neighbors. They don't see a kind of tall building. They don't see the back of our mechanical screen. I did this drawing because I was wondering about corners, right? I teach about corners. Harry Cobb says there's 2 types of architects in the world, those that dimension to the center line and those that dimension to the face. And for years I worried that I was the wrong kind of architect. You dimension to the center line when you're using modules, right? The universal grid, it's a mullion. Doesn't matter how wide the mullion is, as long as you're on the center line, you're good. That produces the Miesian corner. Our building certainly has center lines, but it also has faces. It has the face of the building, which is on the property line. So, and it alternates. So you get this, you get this, you get this. As you look up at the building, you're seeing the dimension of the panel as it rises, as it alternates, up, left, right, left, right, left, right, which is different from this, which is just a kind of, it's an extrusion, just like the mullion. Okay, I'm gonna fly through this. So I teach cases in contemporary construction. I ask my students, what's the difference between fabrication and construction? Anybody know? It's trades. Trades. We have a lot of trades, and all the drawings outside in the lobby attest to this. What are the trades? This is the MIT Museum, all the different disciplines coordinating this. It's important to recognize that our job is to sort of to orchestrate all those systems coming together. Very quickly, one of the things I ask my students to do is to draw a facade for a structural frame that looks an awful lot like the Seagram building. This is Rashad's project. He looked at the corner with these undulating curved glass panels, and he produced his own version of a corner. This is Ken Hasegawa, who was looking at ETFE, multi-story inflatable modules that turn the corner completely differently. Core 3, I've been coordinating Core 3. I've got a whole timeline of all the different studio briefs. I'm going to actually present this in Scott's class on Thursday. How have we been thinking about these assignments? How have they challenged us in different ways? I talk about life safety. I give the example of the ICA as a sort of structurally active megatruss. And my students, like Ian Miley, built this model with tape, showing how the structure is allowing it to span over the highway. Esther Kim's model from last year introduces a kind of structural solution, but it also starts to hint at a kind of environmental solution. The building self-shades on the south face. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to jump maybe towards the. Okay, maybe I'll fly. Are you guys okay? Can I go a little bit after 7:30? Okay, I'll keep going, but I'll be succinct. Okay, so this is the Lithos Hotel in Chengdu, also in Chengdu. We built this model, which looks a little bit like the models that the students are building in the trays. And I like to say, you got to walk the talk, you got to talk the walk. We build models like this, our students build models like this. This is a very effective way to understand how this truss is behaving in 2 directions, is cantilevering in 2 directions. And so building physical models is an incredibly tactile way to sort of test the kind of stiffness of a solution like this. This is the form, and this is the solution, the structural solution. We were surprised to see these photos. Not only did they build it, which we had no idea that they would do, but also they deleted the truss. You see, instead of a steel truss, it's now a concrete beam, right? A massive concrete beam. So even though you think you've got it all figured out, and then how do you clad a building that's meant to look monolithic, that's meant to sort of cohere? We propose these sort of extruded aluminum concavities that were then cut to create these slots that would produce the screening of the building. Here a few months ago, these custom extrusions that have been cut to produce these slots for the hotel. And that's the building at the beginning of the summer. Okay, shifting gears, now back to MIT. Grace described this already. so powerfully the joints in the arch that's a conspicuous absence, right? Sean Collier was killed in the line of duty. How do you memorialize him? Maybe we need to sort of highlight his absence, highlight that something is missing. So, and then this question of fortis, mens et manus, and fortis, strength. How do we translate strength into memory? So here's a figure and then a missing figure that's kind of pantomimed in this buttress walls. Then Mijan proposed to make it out of solid stone. It's not just a form, it's actually a material. It's mass, it's massive. How do you build an arch? Well, the principles are well known. It's compression, there's no tension in it. We built lots and lots of models. We worked with John Oxendorf at MIT to figure it out. You know, the catenary chain, so inverted, is the pure tension chain is the pure compression arch. So principles of compression, principles of load distribution, what lies below the ground. So we checked our geotechnical reports. There's clay there, by the way. There are microplastics. So you're putting all this force into the ground, but what's the ground doing? The force in the ground has to be tying back together, right? The grade beam is the tension that resolves the compression forces going into the ground. Halfway through, we realized there's a duct bank underneath our memorial. Turns out all of the power and data to MIT were running underneath the memorial. So gratefully, our grade beam and our arch was able to span over that. The stone blocks were massive. These are not kitchen counter blocks. These are blocks that are much bigger. They were milled with impressive machinery. We did drawings of every single block. This is the thing. When we fabricated it with robots, we said, here's our digital model. And Jim Durham from Cornerstone said, how do you know where the stone begins and ends? How do you know where the saw begins and ends? I said, well, the saw blade is a constant, and the stone is a variable. And he said, aha, but the saw is wearing at a different rate than the stone. You're cutting the stone with a diamond-tipped saw, but the saw diameter is decreasing every time you cut. So I thought, oh my God, what about our digital model, right? What about our faith in the kind of digital process, right? Turns out the saw blade is diminishing, and the saw needs to be calibrated frequently and adjusted so that we get this sort of perfect, with tolerance, stone block. So questions of digital workflows, questions of our kind of faith and our allegiance to the digital process. This is a beautiful piece of Virginia mist. You see the veins wrap around, and so you see that it's solid. It's not veneer, it's not post-tensioned. It is stone bearing on stone bearing on stone. This was measured as it was constructed. It was monitored by MIT master's and doctoral students. And when the scaffold was removed, we see for the first time this sort of void, this sort of figure, the absent figure was revealed. Okay. And this changed our thinking. We thought about material and media. We used to talk about media as material. Now we talk about material after media. How do we work material with all of our tools? Okay, quickly, pedagogy. That's what we're talking about. This is Columbus, Indiana. Columbus has been called a kind of pilgrimage site for modern architecture. Oh. Sorry about that. I'll restart later. So Columbus, Indiana, small town. It's not Columbus, Ohio. Small town. Great architecture. The Miller House by Saarinen, the First Christian Church by Saarinen Sr., the North Christian Church by Saarinen Jr., SOM, IMPE, Venturi, SOM, Iwamoto Scott, Marlon Blackwell. These projects were funded by the Cummins Foundation. Cummins says, if you pick one of our architects, we'll pay their design fees. It's a pretty good deal. I pitched for the elementary school. I said the elementary school is a framework for a child's imagination. That sounded pretty good. Then they hired us. This is the site. It's an empty field with this beautiful, trees. we said maybe the school should just frame that. Maybe we should just sort of make sure that we're always aware of the context that we're in. And so the school has all these vistas back out. This is fresh work, by the way, never before seen. So it's still smoking. The school is organized around the neighborhood unit. 3 classrooms share an activity zone with 3 other classrooms, and there's a flex room in between. We're learning about schools. All these schools have the same program, but we organize them completely differently. And so we proposed this activity zone, this flex zone. We're learning the lingo. We proposed 4 different versions, and we made lots of pots. We presented 4 schemes, and we went with the one on the upper left. Yay, we're in schematic design. We're working on the site plan, making sure that the classrooms, these 2 are facing the tree line, and these 2 are facing over here. All the parking is sort of on the north side of the site, accommodating stormwater retention ponds, parking, bus parking, sight lines, security concerns, and so on. 741. 2 very quick projects. LOG hosted an exhibition called Model Behavior. Many of our faculty were included in this. We wondered about models of democracy. We wondered about what's going on. How did this happen? What's the plan of the Capitol look like anyways? Where are those great rotundas and Senate chambers? I started to think about spaces of democracy and the spaces where democracy is done. And so I was sort of interested in those rooms. You know, what are those rooms? The kind of the House of Lords or the House of Commons with this sort of oppositional structure, the US sort of semicircle, the horseshoe, and the kind of lecture style space. And then what are the misbehaviors that are happening in these rooms? The brawling and the fighting and the insurrection. And I wondered if these misbehaviors were related to the architecture. How do we think about the spaces of democracy and what happens there? And for this, I turned to my friend and colleague, Antoine Picon, who proposed a very thoughtful response, which is that the space and its decor has something to do with its decorum. How you behave in a space is related to its form, its material, its mood. And then Daniel Zeiblatt, who teaches just across the street, he wrote this book called How Democracies Die. He was talking about the unwritten rules of democracy. And it's not about breaking rules, it's actually about exceeding the kind of unspoken rules, where the erosion of norms and civility is what leads us down this path. So we proposed, we made this sort of booklet about what we learned. We did this exhibition at the Cooper Union in the storefront, showcasing what we researched about spaces of democracy. So this was kind of a side project. We had been working on the University of Virginia Institute of Democracy. This is a new project that occupies this site on a new part of campus, right? This is the central grounds with the academical village. This is the kind of east-west axis of pavilions arranged around a low point, right? This is a high point, this is a low point, and it terminates on the Institute of Democracy. So this is the configuration. This building has a lot of pressure on it. It has to sort of speak to the place. It has to sort of refer to its architecture. And we figured this sort of space of convening, this hall, this drum, might be analogous to the rotunda, screened by a row of white columns. But it's really about that space of gathering of scholars. The shape of the hall is not any of the types that I described. It's kind of an avocado. It has this wraparound balcony on 2 levels and a boardroom that looks like the one in the rotunda, right? So it's evoking some of these sort of bundled figures, these sort of primary forms. But I'm very pleased with this idea of this balcony that wraps around. And so if there's a debate going on, you could stand behind this speaker, or you could stand behind that speaker. You can get different points of view, different vantage points. Anyways, that's, and this is the drawing in the lobby. This is a Design for Freedom pilot project. So this is a program that's trying to certify fair labor in construction, so slave-free labor. That's the site. Okay, in conclusion, I'll wrap it up. Here we are at the end of the lecture, and we find ourselves back on this orange clay from Albemarle County. We've been from the memorial to enslaved laborers to the fair labor of the Institute of Democracy. And these trades, these kinship designations are sort of signaling these laborers that we don't know, but they're here in a way giving them voice. So I began to say that clay is a kind of intrinsically malleable plastic medium. We can shape it with our hands, we mold it to our purposes, we practice shaping it, and in doing so, we develop our ideas. These are some of the descendants from the UVA memorial. Colleen Yates is a 7th generation descendant of Sally Hemings. Datiza Gathers told me that she found herself through the memorial process. She didn't know she was a descendant. Through the memorial process, she discovered she was related to the enslaved. I like to say that we design the world at a distance, but I think design also reshapes us. As we shape the world, it reshapes us. And I think that's what I wanted to conclude with. The memorial was completed, and then new names were discovered. And so this question of the memorial being open-ended actually allows for new names to be added. So this is Lily Hearn, who was one of the 5 enslaved that was added to the wall. Also Davy Hearn, Fanny Gillette Hearn, Bonnie Castle Hearn, and Ben Snowden. So I love the idea that a memorial is unfinished. It's always incomplete, it's always insufficient, but it has the capacity and the promise of an ongoing project. So maybe in conclusion, I would say that Herbert Simon describes science as the study of the world as it is, and design as the study of the world as it ought to be. And I think that ought to be-ness is why we do the things that we do. Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry for going over, but I know there's a debate going on tonight. If you need to leave, please feel free. We won't be offended. Okay. An hour away. Yes. I'm thinking about you, Scott.
If I'm calm, it's okay.
I'm not going to hog the floor here because I know that many of you probably, I know you have questions for Eric. But I am curious just to start us off. First of all, thank you. That was really wonderful to see the sort of trajectory of the work and looking at some of the smaller projects to the larger ones. So I am wondering, so as you, as the project scales have shifted, I mean, I remember in the early days looking at some of the installation work that you did and the kinds of smaller scaled projects that were maybe, you might refer to them as interventions and things like that. As the projects have scaled now to this more institutional scale, can you tell us a little bit about how your design process has changed, especially in relationship to the question of trades? Because, of course, on the smaller project, your direct engagement, the almost DIY-ness of the smaller projects is really quite different than the kind of almost contractual separation that we have with construction managers and others, where we're actually not supposed to talk to the trades, we're supposed to talk to the GC or the... So can you just tell us about how your design process has changed as the projects have scaled?
That's a great question. I think the process is the same, and I know that doesn't sound true. But I do think when we think about an installation that we're going to assemble ourselves, we're thinking about sequence, we're thinking about material, we're thinking about tolerance, we're thinking about shipping and logistics. I'm thinking about the Athens 2004 White Noise, White Light project that we designed and built right before the Olympics. We thought about every single thing, customs, payments, procurement, we made it all with our own hands, and so we had a real sense of the labor that it takes to solder all those little microcontrollers together. It was a pain in the ass. But it produced something magical, and there was a kind of astonishing effect of that kind of work. I think as we shifted from what I said was media as material to thinking now about real materials like stone, ancient materials with their own histories and their own craft, we're still thinking about questions of assembly, procurement, sequencing, tolerance. And so it may not sound true, but I think we still think about them in the same way. Now, if you think about the MIT Museum, we're not installing any of those ducts, none of that, IT infrastructure. That's all done by others. But I do think to coordinate others, you sort of need to think about sequencing, right? You do beam pens. This beam pen is for this trade. Don't put your drainage leader through my beam pen. That's reserved for the HVAC contractor. So we've been thinking through these questions all along. It increases in complexity, but I don't think it changes the fundamental thought process, if you can believe that.
I suppose, though, that it's interesting. I'd love to see your contracts, because most contracts actually don't allow you to do that level of hands-on investigation. So I think that's pretty interesting. Do you structure the practice differently to be able to afford that? Are you robbing Peter to pay Paul?
We sign the contracts that we're presented with. Sometimes they stink. MIT contracts, Harvard contracts. Institutions have legal departments. Someone told me, "Oh, you're working at MIT, they have very talented lawyers." That was chilling. But we signed anyways because we still want to do the work. And so I don't think it's right that institutions exert so much pressure through their contracts. I will say, and I lecture about this in my class, the swings that we designed and built and fabricated and installed and maintained and inspected, never again. You make something, you have a different level of responsibility for it. And so if someone gets hurt, you can get sued. So we got sued over a damaged swing. So I lecture about this in my class, risk and responsibility. And how do you mitigate risk? Our insurance company says, don't you dare get on a ladder and look at that thing that you've installed. Why were you installing? Why did you make that thing anyways? You should be at your desk drawing with your mouse, not in a job site, And so I do think the terms of the practice involve cost, constructability, and risk. And we don't talk about that enough in these spaces, and I think maybe we should. Maybe we should think about, why does the world look the way it does? Because we live in a risk society. And how do architects have the agency to work in that risk society? You need to have knowledge, experience, and expertise. So that's what I hope to focus on in some of my classes.
And we are grateful for them, because they are excellent courses. I am kind of curious. Now, you said, you made a comment about architects dimensioning to the center line. Mm-hmm. Now, I think there's a white paper in that, which I'm really fascinated about, dimensioning to the center line. And the questions that you raise in your work seem to me also to ask questions about the relationship of cladding to form, to the expression of volume. And it seems like you've asked that question in part because the strategies for construction have to do with the kind of laying up of the material and recognizing that it is in fact clad. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I think Harry Cobb had a kind of profound sort of understanding of the practice of architecture. I think as a New York architect working within a kind of frame and envelope, you tend to design to the center line. If you're in practice in LA, you're working with surface and form, you might design to the face. You might dimension to the face, but you tie that face back to the center line. I think it was a trick question. I think you have to design and dimension to both. You tie back the face to the center line. That's a nerdy thing to say. Is architecture tending towards surface and skin? yes. But I think it becomes really interesting when the exterior is also structural. And so it's not just this sort of extra layer, this thin membrane. I interviewed Michael McKinnell once. He designed City Hall when he was 26. And he said, we wanted an architecture of substance, of integrity. We didn't want this candy wrapper architecture. I thought, oh, candy wrapper architecture, that's the architecture of Mies. That's the architecture of envelope and thin membranes, right? City Hall of Boston is meant to be this sort of durable, concrete, monumental thing. I do see a kind of desire to return to that kind of construction, but it's so market-driven, right? I think even Simmons Hall at MIT, if you design that today, which is a load-bearing exterior precast concrete frame, they would say, build it out of steel and clad it, right? That would be all cladding today. I'm getting nerdy. Sorry.
Let's open it to the floor. I'm sure there are so many questions. I have many more nerdy questions to ask. Please.
Jeff Bollinger, on the topic of structural skins, et cetera, have you seen changes to the way you're approaching building envelope with regards to energy efficiency changing? So for example, City Hall wouldn't be built the way it is today given current energy code. You'd have to develop the structure differently. And so current energy code dictates certain tectonic approaches. And I'm curious to know if these evolutions and changes in energy code have also changed the way you've conceptualized the authenticity of structure in your buildings.
That's a great point. The course I teach is called Cases in Contemporary Construction, and I insist that students look at buildings that are built fairly recently, because even looking at City Hall would be a different paradigm. Sometimes students want to draw the Carpenter Center, which is a great building, but I ask them not to look at that because we don't build that way anymore. So I do think we need to deal with the kind of thinness of contemporary architecture, the laminar quality, where there's a vapor barrier and a insulate. All the layers is what we're thinking about. It's not the monolithic, the monomaterial of the single brick or the in a way that's a little bit romantic to think about going back to that. So I do think we want to look at the systems today, the kind of economics of those systems today. We want to equip our students with the tools to think through those questions. I think it's kind of tragic that we'll never build another City Hall Boston again, because that's a building with such kind of integrity, although nobody likes it, right? So maybe that's okay. Energy code, I think it's going to change the window-to-wall ratios. We won't be able to design a glass box anymore. The glass box is a dinosaur. And maybe that's interesting to think about how we teach the glass boxes, how we teach future architects to work within the constraints of our world in climate crisis. So it's probably a good thing. But I think those are some of the questions we should ask of ourselves and our students. Like, the glass box is no longer an option.
I think so many of your projects are really satisfying in terms of the relationship of let's say, the formal aspiration of the project and then how it's executed in construction terms. But as I was looking at what you showed, and we're only seeing, again, a small fraction of what Höweler Yoon has designed. But it also occurs to me that when I look at the projects that you shared tonight, it's the hotel that seems maybe the least satisfying. Is it the least satisfying? And I'm asking partly because so there we see a kind of formal motif of a certain kind of love of a scalloped condition or shape, and the kind of carving out of a void, that sort of shaping that I think that you like a lot. There's something that appeals to you visually about that. But then in that project, the kind of steel structure that was imagined, or the model that you showed, the naked model that you showed, was interesting because it was, certainly it's the structure, but the structure doesn't necessarily viscerally evoke that kind of carving that it seems like the overall project wants to be. So I don't know, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, or can you, because it seems like that actual formal strategies actually showing up in other places. Maybe in some ways you could even say that it was, you see the Collier Memorial actually in some of these other forms. So, they're related. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. I don't mean to pick on that one, but I'm curious
fair.
about it.
It's fair. Scott picks on that one all the time.
Oh, does he?
There's similar formal operations, for sure. The conspicuous absence of the Collier Memorial is trying to pantomime a missing figure for the hotel. That carving identifies entry. It identifies where the front door is, and the entry to the hotel is actually through that large subtraction. It's meant to be contoured like a landscape. The circulation is sort of carved into it, like contours. The bottom half of that curve is occupiable. It's terrain, right? The upper half of that curve is poché, right? And it's just sort of mirroring the kind of the geometric operation of the Boolean, right? We don't build buildings, we do drawings of buildings, and we do drawings with certain tools that have certain operations like lofting and Booleaning. These are becoming a kind of lingua franca of a kind of formal syntax of our time. I do think the deployment of poché, I think, is interesting. It shapes, forms those experiences, so I think we're utilizing them. The question of the truss versus the cladding, I think that's kind of an interesting one. The kind of unnecessary thickness. What is it used for? There's services in there, there's all kinds of things in there, but it is a surplus. I think using surplus productively to shape space, I'm okay with that.
One more question up there.
Hi, my name is Josie Kukta, and I'm really, really fascinated by your work. I did my undergraduate thesis all about pressing my hands into bricks, so can really, really relate to what you're thinking about the relationship between hand and material. I was just wondering, in terms of the UVA memorial, on the outside, you talked about the kind of tooled aspect of it, like that tombstone, and just wondered, in terms of authenticity in the making process, that seems like if you're using a machine rather than a hand tool, how that changes the reflection of the process on the material.
That's a great question. I mean, this is a memorial to memorialize labor, right? Labor and craft, right? The brick maker, the carpenter. And so you have to wonder who labored to build this memorial. Was it human labor, presumably well-paid human labor, union labor, robotic labor? And how does a robot fit into the ethics of labor? The cleft tombstone was a tombstone. You have to imagine that there was not the money to pay for a perfectly hewn tombstone. So there was a kind of economy there, and the roughness maybe reflected the social standing of the person who was being memorialized by that. So to recreate the scalloping with a robot that's referent is the cleft stone, the natural cleft stone. That could be an issue. We thought about, like, can we actually use the face of a block from a quarry and then saw the back off and use an authentic drill mark? That would have a kind of authenticity to it. But we couldn't develop a process that would ensure a kind of repeatability to that. That would be an incredible spec to write, right? You're writing the spec to ensure that the cleft face of a found block would be sawn. It's also conical, right? It's not, those lines are converging. They're not parallel anymore. So there was a number of challenges. I love the idea of a really cleft stone and the real drill marks that would feel more authentic. But at the end, we defaulted to something that was more familiar, more reproducible, where we could insist on a certain quality control. It was risk.
I'm just going to add that it just strikes me, it's a beautiful question, but it strikes me that the word robot is the Czech word for corvée, which is compulsory labor. So the word robot already insists on labor that's given unfreely. So you're kind of reproducing in an inadvertent way a nice kind of, not nice, but a historical meaning is perpetuated there. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more. Oh, Sarah.
Thanks. I love the work. I have to say, I live near the Collier Memorial, and I love that project. I love the UVA project. Every project I've seen is just fantastic. But there's a question that I've been wondering about for a while, and when you showed the Seagram's image versus your project, it brought it home, which is do you have a fear of flatness and continuity? So is the fact that every project has it sort of shows a module, whether of the material or a module of some form of construction, is that a celebration of your nerdy interest in materials and constructability? Is it a countering of modernism? Is it an anxiety about the scale of the size of buildings that we're dealing with today? What's behind it?
All of the above, to be honest. I do think there's a kind of tautness and a flatness to the surfaces of modernism, like the Seagram building, that produces a kind of monotony and a kind of thinness that I feel like is not appropriate anymore. I love the candy wrapper comment because it just dispenses with like a whole world, a whole tradition. But I do think building in Boston, building in historic contexts, I think there's a kind of different kind of resonance with its context that calls for more materiality, more depth, more surface, more texture. I mean, this was approved by Boston Landmarks Commission, right? A 20-story building in a landmark neighborhood. It was unimaginable. But the reason it was approved because they said, well, maybe it's not inappropriate to build tall and thick next to short and crafted. And in the end, the neighbors came across the street and they said, we love your building. You know, how could it be that, you know, the NIMBYs in the neighborhood would find qualities in the adjacent building, and they would find neighbors living next door. So there was definitely a kind of calibration to the process of building in a neighborhood in a neighborly way. There was definitely a consideration of shadow and light and the play of light and shadow on surfaces that are not flat. I talked about, you know, shadow making, like certain architectures create beautiful shadows, and depth does produce that. It makes it feel like it belongs. And so there's an anxiety about and a fear of flatness and continuity, but there's also a desire and a pleasure for texture and liveliness. Like the buildings somehow come alive. They're animated by their textures. And I do like the idea that you see the module, that it doesn't dissolve into a monolith, that there's a kind of trace there. So I do think it's all of the above, but maybe it's situational. Like in certain contexts, we have to think about it in different ways to respond to the kind of site-specific context in which we're working. But working in Boston, we're always confronted with this question of how do you build next to that, and then who will build next to you, you know? And I think that's a particular kind of training that we didn't expect to be experts in.
And you certainly are. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you.